Hey there, Linux enthusiasts! Welcome back to Ton Does Linux and More. I'm your host, and wow, this week in the Linux world was absolutely insane. I mean, we're talking about some of the biggest changes I've seen in months really. And trust me, you do not want to miss this one. So, what do we have this week? Well, we've got Ubuntu reaching a major end-of-life milestone that's affecting millions of users. GNOME making this revolutionary decision that's going to change how we use Linux desktops. Forever, basically. And some incredible gaming improvements that are going to make your Steam Deck and your gaming rigs perform better than ever before. Plus, we're diving into some critical security updates, major distribution releases, and oh yeah, some hardware news that's got the community really buzzing. So if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the kind of weekly Linux coverage you absolutely need to stay on top of. And ring that notification bell. Trust me on this one. You won't want to miss what's coming next week either. Alright, let's jump right into the biggest stories that basically rocked the Linux world this week. Okay, so let's start with something that might not sound exciting, but it's absolutely critical for every single Linux user watching this video, and that's kernel security. This week we saw the release of multiple stable kernel versions, and they all include something really important that you need to know about. So on July 10th, Greg Crowe-Hartman released Linux kernel 6.15.6, along with several long-term support versions, including 6.12.37 LTS, 6.6.97 LTS, 6.1.144 LTS, and 5.15.187 LTS. Now, you might be thinking, okay, just another routine kernel update, but here's the thing. These releases include mitigations for a brand new class of security vulnerabilities called transient scheduler attacks, or TSA for short. These TSA vulnerabilities specifically affect certain AMD processors, and they represent what security researchers are calling a new class of side-channel attacks. Think of it like this. Imagine if someone could peek at your computer's internal scheduling decisions and use that information to potentially access data they shouldn't be able to see. That's essentially what these attacks can do. Now, here's what makes this particularly interesting from a Linux perspective. The mitigation for these vulnerabilities requires two things working together. First, you need these new kernel patches that we just got. And second, you need updated CPU microcode or system firmware from your hardware manufacturer. This is a perfect example of how Linux kernel development and hardware security work. Well, hand in hand, really. The patches were initially merged into the Linux 6.16 Git kernel during what's called Patch Tuesday, and then they were quickly backported to all the stable kernel branches. This shows you just how seriously the kernel maintainers take security issues. When something this important comes up, they don't wait around. Speaking of Linux 6.16, we're expecting release candidate 6 to drop this Sunday, and the stable 6.16 kernel should be ready by the end of July. This upcoming release is going to be particularly significant because it's where these TSA mitigations were first implemented and tested. So what does this mean for you as a Linux user? First, make sure you're keeping your kernel updated. If you're running a distribution that automatically handles kernel updates, you're probably already protected, or, you will be very soon. If you're on something like Arch or Gentoo, where you manage updates manually, definitely prioritize getting these new kernel versions installed. But kernel security wasn't the only major story this week. In fact, we had some distribution news that's going to affect way more users directly. And it starts with Ubuntu making a decision that millions of people need to know about right now. And here we are at probably the biggest story of the week for everyday Linux users. Ubuntu 24.10, codenamed Oracular Oriole, officially reached its end of life on July 10th, 2025. Now, if you're running Ubuntu 24.10 right now, this is not a drill. You need to pay attention to this section. Ubuntu 24.10 was what's called an interim release, which means it only gets 9 months of support compared to the 5 years you get with LTS releases. And as of July 10th, Canonical has completely stopped providing security updates, package updates, and, any kind of official support for this version. Here's why this matters so much. If you're still running Ubuntu 24.10, your system is now vulnerable to any new security issues that get discovered, and you won't receive fixes for them. This isn't just a theoretical problem. This is a real security risk that you need to address immediately. So what are your options? You've got two main paths forward. Option 1 is to upgrade to Ubuntu 25.04, which is codenamed Plucky Puffin and is the current latest release. This will give you the newest features and another 9 months of support until the next interim release cycle. Option 2, and this is what I'd recommend for most users, is to move to Ubuntu 24.04 LTS. LTS stands for Long-Term Support, and this version will be supported until 2029. That's 5 full years of security updates and stability. If you want a system that you can set up once and not worry about major upgrades for years, LTS is absolutely the way to go. Before Ubuntu 24.10 went end of life, Canonical's kernel team released one final kernel update based on version 6.11.0. This was specifically designed to give users one last chance to get important fixes before making the transition to a supported version. But Ubuntu wasn't the only distribution making news this week. We also saw a major update from CatchyOS, and this one is particularly exciting if you're into gaming on Linux, or just want the absolute best performance from your system. CatchyOS July 2025 just dropped, and it's packed with features that are going to make a lot of Linux users very happy. This is the 5th release from the CatchyOS team this year, and they've been consistently delivering performance-focused improvements that you just don't see in other distributions. One of the most requested features finally made it into this release. You can now choose your default shell during installation. You can pick between Fish, ZSH, or stick with the traditional bash. This might seem like a small thing, but for power users who have strong preferences about their shell environment, this is huge. CatchyOS is also making the jump to Wayland by default for KDE Plasma users. This is part of a broader industry trend we're seeing, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it shows that even performance-focused distributions are confident that Wayland is ready for prime time. But here's where it gets really interesting for gamers. CatchyOS now includes FWPD by default, which means easier firmware updates for your gaming peripherals and hardware. Plus, they've added support for the Lenovo Legion Go in their handheld edition, which is, well, it's great news for portable gaming enthusiasts. We also saw Parrot OS 6.4 release this week with Linux kernel 6.12 and a bunch of new cybersecurity tools. If you're into penetration testing or security research, this update brings some really powerful new capabilities to the table. But speaking of major changes, the desktop environment news this week was absolutely revolutionary. We're talking about changes that are going to affect how millions of Linux users interact with their systems every single day. Okay, this is where things get really interesting, and I'm talking about a change that's going to fundamentally alter the Linux desktop experience for millions of users. GNOME 49 Alpha just dropped for public testing, and they've made a decision that's absolutely massive. X11 sessions are now disabled by default. Let me put this in perspective for you. X11, also known as the X Window system, has been the foundation of Linux desktop environments for literally decades. It's what's been powering your desktop graphics, window management, and input handling since the early days of Linux. And now, GNOME is saying, we're done with that. Wayland is in the future, and we're moving forward. For those who might not be familiar with the technical details, Wayland is a newer display protocol that's designed to be more secure, more efficient, and better suited for modern hardware. Think of it like upgrading from an old analog TV signal to a modern digital one. Same basic function, but everything works better, faster, and, well, more reliably. The benefits of Wayland are pretty significant. You get better security because applications can't spy on each other the way they could under X11. You get better performance, especially for gaming and multimedia applications. And you get better support for modern features like high DPI displays, multi-monitor setups, and, touch input. GNOME 49 is scheduled for final release on September 17th, 2025, which means we've got about 2 months of testing and refinement ahead of us. But the fact that they're confident enough to disable X11 by default in the alpha release tells you just how mature Wayland has become. And GNOME isn't the only desktop environment making major moves this week. KDE Plasma 6.3.6 was released with a bunch of improvements and bug fixes. And we also got KDE Framework 6.16, which provides the underlying libraries that power the entire KDE ecosystem. What's particularly interesting about the KDE updates is how they're focusing on polish and stability. Plasma 6 has been out for a while now, and these incremental updates are really about making the experience as smooth and reliable as possible. We're seeing improvements in everything, from window management to system settings to, well, application integration. But the Wayland story doesn't stop with the major desktop environments. This week, we also saw updates to several Wayland native applications and tools. LabWC 0.9 was released with support for WL-Roots 0.19, which is a crucial library that many Wayland compositors depend on. We also got Miracle WM 0.6 with rounded corners support, which might seem cosmetic, but shows how the Wayland ecosystem is maturing to support all the visual features users expect. So, what does all this mean for you as a Linux user? If you're already running a recent distribution, there's a good chance you're already using Wayland without even realizing it. Most major distributions have been defaulting to Wayland for a while now, and the transition has been, well, pretty seamless for most users. However, if you're using specialized software, maybe you're doing video production, or you're using some older applications that haven't been updated for Wayland yet, you might want to test things out before making the full switch. The good news is that most distributions still offer X11 as a fallback option, so you can always switch back if you run into issues. What we're seeing here is really the culmination of years of development work. The Linux desktop is going through its biggest architectural change in decades, and it's happening remarkably smoothly. When you see GNOME confident enough to disable X11 by default, and distributions like CatchyOS making Wayland the default for KDE Plasma, you know we've reached a tipping point. And speaking of major improvements, the gaming news this week was absolutely incredible. We're talking about changes that are going to make Linux gaming faster, smoother, and more competitive with Windows than ever before. Alright gamers, this section is going to blow your mind because we're talking about improvements that are going to make your Linux gaming experience significantly better. And it all starts with something called Anti-Lag 2. CatchyOS made headlines this week by including patched Mesa drivers that support Anti-Lag 2. And this is huge for anyone who games on Linux. Anti-Lag 2 is AMD's technology for reducing input latency in games, and until now, it's been primarily a Windows feature. But thanks to the work being done in the Mesa project, Linux users are finally getting access to this performance-boosting technology. Let me explain what Anti-Lag 2 actually does, because this isn't just marketing hype. This is real, measurable performance improvement. When you're gaming, there's always some delay between when you move your mouse or press a key and when you see the result on screen. Anti-Lag 2 works by optimizing the graphics pipeline to reduce this delay, making your games feel more responsive and, well, giving you a competitive edge. Especially in fast-paced games like first-person shooters, the implementation in Mesa uses something called VK-AMD Anti-Lag as an implicit Vulkan layer. Now, this is still a pending merge request in the main Mesa codebase, but CatchyOS has decided to include it in their Mesa Git package, which means their users get to test this technology right now instead of waiting for the official release. But that's not all. CatchyOS also updated their Proton CatchyOS package to support Anti-Lag 2, and they added something called the Proton FSR4 Upgrade environment variable. This allows games that are using FSR 3.1 to be automatically upgraded to use FSR 4, which is AMD's latest upscaling technology. For those who might not be familiar, FSR stands for Fidelity FX Super Resolution, and it's AMD's answer to NVIDIA's DLSS. It's a technology that renders games at a lower resolution and then uses smart algorithms to upscale them to your display resolution, giving you better performance without a significant loss in visual quality. FSR 4 represents the latest and greatest version of this technology. The gaming improvements don't stop there. Mesa 25.2 is branching next week, and it's bringing major enhancements to the Power VR Vulkan driver. Power VR might not be a household name like AMD or NVIDIA, but they make graphics processors that are used in a lot of embedded systems and mobile devices. And better Linux support for these chips opens up new possibilities for Linux gaming on alternative hardware platforms. We also got some interesting news from the Intel graphics front. Intel's Mesa drivers now include an option to disable something called Xe3's Variable Register Thread feature, or VRT for short. This might sound technical, but it's actually about giving users more control over how their Intel graphics hardware behaves, which can be important for troubleshooting performance issues or compatibility problems with specific games. On the hardware front, CatchyOS Handheld Edition now officially supports the Lenovo Legion Go, which is, well, It's great news for portable gaming enthusiasts. The Legion Go is one of the newer Steam Deck competitors, and having official Linux distribution support makes it a much more attractive option for people who want to run a full Linux desktop on their handheld gaming device. What's really exciting about all these developments is that they represent a fundamental shift in how seriously the Linux gaming ecosystem is being taken. We're not just getting ports of Windows technologies anymore, we're getting day and date support for cutting-edge gaming features, and in some cases, we're even getting better implementations than what's available on Windows. This is particularly relevant if you're using a Steam Deck or thinking about getting one. Valve's investment in Linux gaming has created this incredible ecosystem where improvements like anti-lag 2 support benefit everyone, not just Steam Deck users. When CatchyOS includes these optimizations, it means, well, any Linux gamer can take advantage of them. Looking ahead, the fact that these gaming technologies are being actively developed and integrated into Linux distributions suggests that we're going to see even more performance improvements in the coming months. The gap between Linux and Windows gaming performance continues to shrink, and in some cases, Linux is actually pulling ahead. But gaming wasn't the only area where we saw exciting developments this week. The broader Linux community had some major announcements that are going to affect developers, hardware enthusiasts, and, well, open source advocates. Let's talk about some of the community and hardware developments that caught my attention this week, because there's some really exciting stuff happening beyond just the software updates. First up, System76 unveiled their new Adder WS Linux laptop, and this thing it's an absolute powerhouse. System76 has been one of the most consistent advocates for Linux hardware, and the Adder WS continues their tradition of building machines that are designed from the ground up to run Linux perfectly. What makes the Adder WS special isn't just that it comes with Linux pre-installed, though that's certainly nice. It's that every component has been specifically chosen and tested to work flawlessly with Linux. No hunting for drivers, no compatibility issues, no weird quirks with suspend and resume. It just works. And well, it works really well. This is part of a broader trend we're seeing where hardware manufacturers are taking Linux seriously as a desktop operating system. When companies like System76 can build a sustainable business around Linux laptops, it proves that there's real demand for this kind of hardware, and it encourages other manufacturers to improve their Linux support. On the enterprise side, Red Hat made a significant announcement this week by offering free RHEL access for business developers. This is a big deal because Red Hat Enterprise Linux is one of the most important commercial Linux distributions, and it's traditionally been expensive to access for individual developers or small businesses. What this means is that developers can now get hands-on experience with RHEL without having to convince their companies to pay for expensive licenses. This is going to help more developers become familiar with enterprise Linux environments, which ultimately benefits the entire ecosystem. We also saw a bunch of important application updates this week that are worth mentioning. Thunderbird 140, codenamed Eclipse, was released with native experimental Exchange support. This is huge for anyone who needs to use Linux in a corporate environment where Exchange is the email standard. Amarok 3.3 was released with Qt6 and KF6 support, plus GStreamer integration. For those who remember the golden age of Linux music players, Amarok was always one of the best, and it's great to see it continuing to evolve with modern technologies. OBS Studio 31.1 came out with Windows on ARM support, which might not seem directly relevant to Linux users, but it shows how the open source ecosystem benefits everyone. When OBS adds support for new platforms, the underlying improvements often benefit Linux users too. Krita 5.2.10 was released with bug fixes ahead of some major feature releases that are coming soon. Kdenlive 25.04.3 wrapped up its series with key bug fixes. These might seem like minor updates, but they represent the constant, steady improvement that makes Linux such a great platform for creative work. One story that really caught my attention was the Bottles team calling for funding support to sustain their development. Bottles is an incredibly useful tool for running Windows applications on Linux, and it's a perfect example of how community-driven projects need ongoing support to continue improving. This highlights one of the ongoing challenges in the open source world. How do we sustainably fund the development of tools that millions of people rely on? It's something the community continues to grapple with, and it's why supporting projects you use, whether through donations, contributions, or just spreading the word is, well, it's so important. All of these developments, from major kernel security updates to revolutionary desktop environment changes to gaming breakthroughs to community initiatives, paint a picture of a Linux ecosystem that's more vibrant, more capable, and more user-focused than ever before. What a week it's been in the Linux world. Let me quickly recap the major themes we've covered, because honestly, any one of these stories would have been big news on its own, and, well, we got all of them in a single week. We started with critical security updates that protect AMD processor users from a new class of attacks. We covered Ubuntu 24.10 reaching end of life, which affects millions of users who need to upgrade immediately. We explored the desktop environment revolution, with GNOME disabling X11 by default and the entire ecosystem moving toward Wayland. We dove into gaming improvements that are making Linux more competitive with Windows than ever before, and we highlighted community developments that show just how healthy and growing the Linux ecosystem really is. Looking ahead to next week, we've got Mesa 25.2 branching, which should bring even more graphics improvements. Linux 6.16-RC6 is dropping, moving us closer to the stable 6.16 release, and I'm keeping an eye on several other projects that might have major announcements coming soon. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel reach more Linux enthusiasts who need to stay informed about these developments. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly Linux news roundups. I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these stories affected you the most? Are you planning to upgrade from Ubuntu 24.10? Have you tried Wayland yet? Are you excited about the gaming improvements? Let me know what you think, and if there are specific topics you'd like me to cover in more detail in future videos. Next week, I'm planning a deep dive into the Wayland transition, what it means for different types of users, how to troubleshoot common issues, and why this change is so important for the future of Linux desktops. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep doing Linux. I'll see you in the next video.